The Connecticut Valley Killer. On the night of August 6, 1988, a young woman who was 7 months pregnant pulled into the parking lot of a closed convenience store in West Swansea, New Hampshire. A stranger approached her car, and in the minutes that followed, she was stabbed 27 times. She survived. Her baby survived. And to this day, she remains the only known person to have faced the man responsible for terrorizing the Connecticut River Valley and lived to describe him. Her name was Jane Borowski, and the composite sketch she gave police is still one of the only tangible leads in a case that stretches back a full decade before that night. New London, New Hampshire, October 24th, 1978. Catherine Milliken, 27 years old, had gone to the Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve to observe birds. It was the kind of quiet afternoon that defines small-town New England. She never came home. Her body was discovered at the preserve, and she had been stabbed at least 29 times. Over the next 10 years, 6 more women across the Connecticut River Valley, a rural corridor straddling the New Hampshire and Vermont border, would meet similar fates. Betsy Critchley, 37, a university student, vanished while hitchhiking in July of 1981. Her remains were found weeks later in Unity, New Hampshire. Bernice Courtemanche, a young nurse's aide, disappeared in May of 1984 from Claremont. Her remains would not surface for nearly 2 years, found near the Sugar River with her throat cut. Ellen Freed, a supervising nurse at Valley Regional Hospital, was last heard on a payphone around 2 in the morning on July 22, 1984, telling her sister about a strange car circling the parking lot. Her remains were located more than a year later. Ava Morse, 27, vanished while hitchhiking near Charlestown in July of 1985. Loggers found her remains the following spring, roughly 500 feet from where Critchley had been discovered. Linda Moore, 36, was harmed fatally inside her own Saxton's River, Vermont home in April of 1986, stabbed 25 times. And Barbara Agnew, 38, a nurse, disappeared after a day of skiing at Stratton Mountain in January of 1987. Her body was found that March in Hartland, Vermont. The pattern was consistent: stab wounds, women in rural areas, bodies left in remote wooded locations, and no forensic evidence pointing to a single suspect. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit has stated that the connections between all 7 cases cannot be formally confirmed until one of them is solved. But the geographic clustering, the method, and the victim profile have led investigators to work them as a series. Borowski's account remains the closest thing to a direct encounter on record. She described her attacker and the vehicle he drove, a Jeep Wagoneer with a partial New Hampshire plate. Her baby survived the attack, but was later diagnosed with mild cerebral palsy. Despite the severity of her injuries, Borowski cooperated extensively with investigators and sat for a composite sketch that was circulated across the region. In the decades since, she has participated in podcasts and media interviews, publicly evaluating suspects as law enforcement brought them to her attention. Investigators focused on a handful of names over the years. Michael Nicolau, a Vietnam veteran and Army helicopter pilot who owned a Jeep Wagoneer matching the vehicle Borowski described, became the prime suspect after a Florida private investigator advanced the theory in 2006. Nicolau had taken the lives of his estranged wife and stepdaughter in Tampa in December of 2005 before ending his own life. He was also the leading person of interest in the disappearance of his common-law partner in 1988. But Jane Borowski herself has publicly stated she does not believe Nicolau was the man who attacked her. Vermont State Police confirmed there is no forensic evidence linking him to the Valley cases. DNA from the crime scenes has reportedly not been compared against Nicolau's CODIS profile, despite years of lobbying from the victims' families. Other names surfaced over the decades. Gary Westover, who allegedly confessed on his deathbed in 1997 to involvement in one of the cases. An unnamed Massachusetts man whose son came forward in 2012, describing his late father returning home in bloodied clothing and driving a Jeep Wagoneer. Borowski reportedly said the hairs on the back of her neck stood up when she saw the man's photograph. None of it led to charges. As of October 29, 2025, the 47th anniversary of Catherine Milliken's passing, the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit, State Police, Fish and Game officers, and New London Police conducted a search of the Esther Currier Wildlife Management Area, near where Milliken was found. New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella announced the action publicly. The head of the Cold Case Unit, Chris Knowles, stated that new technology was being deployed at the scene, technology that did not exist when Milliken lost her life, and that the hope was to finally bring answers to the family and community. The Connecticut River Valley case remains open. 7 women, 1 survivor, and nearly 5 decades without a name. Sometimes the hardest cases to solve are the ones where the evidence was never in a city database or a surveillance feed, but scattered across hundreds of miles of forest and river. And that same problem, the vastness of a hunting ground, defines the next case on this list. Only this one played out not in the woods of New England, but under the streetlights of Glasgow. Bible John. Between February of 1968 and October of 1969, 3 women in Glasgow, Scotland, were found after spending their final hours at the same venue, the Barrowland Ballroom, one of the most popular dance halls in the city, became the last place each of them was seen alive. The man responsible was never identified, but the name given to him by police would endure for more than half a century. Patricia Docker, 25, an auxiliary nurse, was found on February 23, 1968, in a lane near her home in the Langside neighborhood. She had been beaten and strangled. 18 months later, Jemima McDonald, 31 and a mother of 3, was discovered on August 18, 1969, in a derelict tenement on McKeith Street in Bridgeton. She had suffered the same fate. Then came Helen Puttock, 29 and a mother of 2, found on October 31, 1969, in a back court on Earl Street in Scotstoun. She too had been strangled, and investigators recovered a bite mark on her wrist along with biological evidence. What set this case apart was a single witness. Helen Puttock's sister, Jeannie, had shared a taxi with the man that night. She described him as well-spoken and recalled him quoting scripture, condemning what he called dens of iniquity. The press gave him a name that would define the investigation for decades: Bible John. Glasgow police commissioned artist Lennox Patterson to create composite sketches, the first ever authorized by the Scottish Crown Office for public release of a suspect image. The sketches were plastered across Scotland, and what followed was one of the largest manhunts in Scottish criminal history. Thousands of men were questioned. Dance halls across the city were placed under surveillance. The public response was enormous, but no arrest followed. The most prominent suspect for years was John Irvine McInnes, a former Scots Guard who took his own life in 1980. His body was exhumed in 1996 for DNA comparison against the biological evidence recovered from Helen Puttock. The tests excluded him. Improved technology in 2005 confirmed the exclusion a second time, when convicted serial offender Peter Tobin was arrested in 2006 for the taking of Angelica Cluck's life, and later connected to earlier victims Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. Investigators checked his DNA against the Puttock evidence as well. Another exclusion. Tobin also had an alibi for the MacDonald and Puttock timeframes, a wedding in Brighton in August of 1969. In 2023, BBC journalist Audrey Gillen released a podcast titled Bible John, Creation of a Serial Killer, which argued that police may have incorrectly linked 3 separate cases into a single narrative. Police Scotland confirmed that October that they would review the podcast's claims. The following year, Australian historian Dr. Gillian Bevan-Mizzi published a book naming Glasgow printer John Templeton, who had passed away in 2015, as a new suspect. Templeton had been interviewed and cleared by police back in 1969. As of 2025, the biological profile from the Puttock case remains on file. The semen and bite mark evidence are among the oldest retained forensic samples in Scottish criminal history. Whether Bible John was one man or three separate offenders remains an open debate, and the case is officially unresolved. 3 women, 1 dance hall, and a nickname that outlasted every lead, every exhumation, and every theory. But while Glasgow's investigators were at least working with a witness description and forensic evidence, the next case on this list offered almost nothing. No witnesses, no cause of death. Just 11 bodies buried in silence on the outskirts of Albuquerque, waiting years to be found. The West Mesa Bone Collector. On February 2, 2009, a woman walking her dog across a barren stretch of land on Albuquerque's West Mesa noticed something protruding from the dirt. It was a human bone. Within days, investigators had uncovered a burial site spanning a 92-acre area. And over the weeks that followed, the remains of 11 women and 1 unborn child were recovered from that same patch of earth. So how does someone bury 12 sets of remains on the edge of a major American city, and for years, no one notices? All 11 women were eventually identified by 2010. Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Virginia Cloven, Cinnamon Elks, Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, Michelle Valdez, who had been carrying an unborn child at the time. 2 of the victims were minors, young girls who had gone missing from their homes and communities. 10 of the 11 women had connections to the streets and struggled with addiction. 1 young victim was the only one who did not. The cause of death was never officially confirmed for most of the remains. An Albuquerque Police Department cold case investigator stated in a 2022 department briefing that the women had not been shot and showed no signs of blunt force trauma, which pointed toward strangulation, though this remains the working theory rather than a confirmed finding. 3 suspects drew significant attention, though none were ever charged. Lorenzo Montoya, a pressman who lived less than 3 miles from the burial site, had tire tracks from the area traced back toward his trailer. In December of 2006, Montoya assaulted and strangled a young woman and was shot by her companion while attempting to move her body. A video recovered from Montoya's camera showed him with what appeared to be a deceased woman, along with audio consistent with preparing a body for disposal. Former Albuquerque Police Chief Michael Geyer called Montoya their best suspect. Joseph Blee, convicted in 2015 on multiple counts of assault and sentenced to 90 years, was connected to the case through a nursery tree tag found at the burial site that traced back to a nursery he frequented. His DNA was also found on a woman who lost her life on Central Avenue. Blee had been known to law enforcement for years before the West Mesa discovery, and the sheer number of convictions on his record raised questions about how long his pattern of violence had gone unchecked. Fred Reynolds, another person of interest, had photographs of missing women in his possession. He passed away from natural causes in January of 2009, weeks before the burial site was even discovered. And no, I am not making that up. The timing of Reynolds' passing, just before the discovery, means investigators lost the chance to question one of their most viable leads permanently. The burial site itself showed signs of repeated use over a period of years, suggesting that whoever was responsible had returned to the same location multiple times between approximately 2003 and 2005, when the last of the victims went missing. On April 7, 2025, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham signed House Bill 340 into law. The legislation, known as Chapter 42, allows the DNA of deceased suspects to be uploaded to the CODIS database with judicial approval. The bill was sponsored by Representative Yanira Gorola of Albuquerque, who stated publicly that 16 years after the West Mesa discovery, this law represented an important step toward bringing peace and closure to the families. Albuquerque Police Commander Kyle Hartsock added that the purpose of the legislation was rooted in a simple principle, that these victims and their families still deserve to know what happened. a $100,000 reward remains in place. As of 2026, the West Mesa case is open. None of the 3 leading suspects were ever charged. 2 of them are no longer alive to be questioned. The hope now rests with forensic genealogy and the new legal framework that could finally match DNA from the burial site to a name. The West Mesa burial ground was discovered by accident, a dog walk on a quiet afternoon that uncovered years of hidden violence. But in the hills outside Florence, Italy, the pattern of harm was anything but hidden. It unfolded across 17 years, in full view of the public, and still, the person pulling the trigger was never definitively identified. The Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, 8 couples were attacked in the countryside surrounding Florence, Italy. Every one of them was in a parked car or a campsite at night. Every one of them was shot with the same .22 caliber Beretta pistol, loaded with Winchester ammunition marked with an H on the cartridge base. 16 people lost their lives across those 8 attacks. In 4 of the cases, the female victims were subjected to post-mortem mutilation with a knife. So why, after decades of investigation, multiple trials, and 3 convictions, does this case remain one of the most contested, unsolved series in European criminal history? If you had asked anyone in Florence in the early 1980s what they feared most, the answer would have been the same. Il Mostro, the monster. Couples avoided the countryside at night. Local authorities issued public warnings, and still, the attacks continued with chilling regularity. The first documented attack, the 1968 case of Barbara Lacci and Antonio Lobianco in Signa, was initially treated as a crime of passion. It was only after subsequent attacks with the same weapon that investigators linked it to the series. The victims included Italians and foreign tourists alike. In September of 1983, German university students Horst Wilhelm Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch were targeted. Investigators believe the attacker mistook Rusch for a woman. In September of 1985, French tourists Jean-Michel Kravitchvili and Nadine Morio became the final confirmed victims. After their passing, a portion of Morio's body was mailed to the Florence prosecutor's office in an act of direct provocation. That is not a typo, by the way. The person responsible communicated with the authorities using remains. The legal proceedings surrounding this case are as tangled as the investigation itself. Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer, was convicted in 1994 for 7 of the 8 double homicides. His conviction was overturned on appeal in 1996. The Supreme Court of Cassation ordered a retrial, but Pacciani suffered a fatal heart attack in February of 1998 before it could begin. Italian law does not classify him as innocent or guilty. His case simply ended. 2 of his associates, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lodi, the so-called companions of afternoon snacks, were convicted in 2000. Vanni received a life sentence for 5 of the 8 attacks, and Lodi received 26 years for 4. Lodi's confession was the centerpiece of the prosecution, but it was heavily criticized by legal scholars. Lodi passed away in 2002. Vanni passed away in 2009. The weapon was never recovered, and in August of 2024, a development emerged that could reshape the entire case. Italian-American oncologist Lorenzo Iovino's analysis identified the same male DNA on bullets recovered from 3 of the 8 crime scenes, specifically the 1983, 1984, and 1985 attacks. The DNA does not match Pacciani, Vanni, Lodi, or any previously convicted suspect. In simple terms, the biological evidence from the bullets points to a man who has never been named in any of the legal proceedings. Critics, including former lawyer Roberto Taddeo, cautioned that the DNA could be the result of investigator contamination during evidence handling. A separate figure, Giampiero Vigilante, a friend of Pacciani whose property yielded newspaper clippings about the crimes and matching ammunition during a search in the 1980s, was reinvestigated in 2017, cleared for a lack of evidence in 2020, and passed away in January of 2024. Families of the victims have called for his DNA to be compared against the bullet evidence. Families of the victims, represented by attorney Walter Biscotti, have pushed for the case to be reopened and for further DNA comparisons. In July of 2025, a court in Genoa rejected the latest motion. The Netflix docuseries Il Mostro, released worldwide on October 22, 2025, and directed by Stefano Sollima, has reignited international interest. The series premiered out of competition at the 82nd Venice International Film Festival. As of 2026, the case of the Monster of Florence sits in a legal gray area. 3 men were convicted. The actual identity of the shooter remains unconfirmed, and bullet-borne DNA from 3 crime scenes points to someone the courts have never addressed. Across the Atlantic, and a decade earlier, another city was dealing with its own string of unsolved cases. Only in San Francisco, the barrier to solving them was not a lack of evidence. It was the fact that the surviving witnesses refused to come forward, because doing so would have meant revealing a secret that, in 1975, could have destroyed their lives. The Doodler. In the mid-1970s, a man began frequenting the gay bars and late-night gathering spots of San Francisco's Castro and Tenderloin districts. He would sit with other men, sketch animal figures on napkins, and introduce himself as a cartoonist. Then, between January of 1974 and June of 1975, 6 men were found dead across the city's coastline and parks, and 3 more survived attacks that nearly took their lives. Gerald Kavanaugh, 49, was found on January 27, 1974, at Ocean Beach with 16 stab wounds. Joseph Stevens, 27, a comedian and performer, was discovered at Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park that June. Klaus Christmann, 31, was found at Ocean Beach in July. Frederick Capon, 32, a Navy veteran, was discovered at Ocean Beach the following May. Harold Goldberg, 66, was found at Land's End in June of 1975. Warren Andrews, assaulted in April of 1975 at Land's End, never regained consciousness after being discovered by passers-by. He passed away weeks later and was officially added as the 6th confirmed victim by the San Francisco Police Department in January of 2022. 3 men survived the Doodler's attacks, and this is where the case fractures into something that defines an entire era. One of the survivors was described as a well-known entertainer. Another was a member of the Swedish diplomatic corps. The third was never publicly identified. All 3 refused to testify because doing so would have required them to publicly acknowledge their sexuality. In 1975, in a country where homosexuality was still classified as a mental disorder by parts of the medical establishment, that was a price none of them were willing to pay. Investigators were left with witnesses who could identify the man responsible, but would not do so in any setting where their words carried legal weight. The San Francisco Police Department interviewed a man in January of 1976 who remains the primary person of interest. He was described as a black man between 19 and 25 years old, approximately 6 feet tall, slender, who sketched for his companions at a diner on Market and Church Streets called the Truck Stop. His name has been withheld by investigators to avoid compromising the case. In 47 years, the investigation had new developments, but no arrest. The SFPD released age-progressed sketches of the suspect in January of 2022, and again in January of 2023. The reward was raised from $100,000 in 2022 to $250,000 by 2023. Cold case detective Dan Cunningham told the San Francisco Chronicle in January of 2023 that the department had new potential evidence to test and was working on obtaining documentation that could elevate the person of interest to a formal suspect. As of 2026, the Doodler case remains open. The suspect has never been publicly named. The surviving witnesses, if still alive, have never changed their position. And the San Francisco Police Department is still working through evidence with modern forensic tools, hoping that technology can accomplish what testimony could not. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. The Zodiac Killer. On December 5, 2020, a team of 3 codebreakers from 3 different countries cracked a cipher that had defeated the FBI, the NSA, and thousands of amateur cryptographers for 51 years. The message inside was taunting, defiant, and offered nothing useful for identifying its author. The Zodiac wrote that he was not afraid of the gas chamber because it would send him to paradise sooner. So after 5 confirmed deaths, 4 cryptograms, and an estimated 2,500 suspects investigated over more than half a century, how has the most prolific letter-writing offender in American criminal history remained completely anonymous? Nobody was paying attention to the quiet stretch of Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California, on the night of December 20th, 1968. 2 young students had parked there, the way dozens of couples did on any given weekend. They were found shot. At the time, it was a tragedy, but not yet a pattern. That was about to change. On July 4th, 1969, at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, Michael Mageau, 19, and Darlene Ferrin, 22, were sitting in a parked car when a man approached and opened fire. Ferrin lost her life. Mageau survived despite multiple gunshot wounds. Less than an hour later, a man called the Vallejo Police Department and claimed responsibility for both attacks. Then came the letters. 3 nearly identical messages were sent to 3 Bay Area newspapers in late July of 1969, each containing 1/3 of a 408-symbol cipher. The author demanded the papers publish the cipher on their front pages, threatening to go on what he described as a rampage if they refused. The cipher, now known as the Z408, was decoded on August 8, 1969, by Donald and Betty Harden, a married couple who taught in Salinas, California. The decrypted text was a boast about the thrill of taking lives, but it contained no identifying information. On September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, the attacker approached Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, wearing a hooded costume with a crossed circle symbol on the chest. He bound them with rope and stabbed them both. Hartnell survived. Shepard did not, passing 2 days later. The attacker wrote on their car door in black marker, listing the dates of previous attacks. The final confirmed attack came on October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. Taxi driver Paul Stein, 29, was shot while on duty. The person responsible tore a piece of Stein's shirt and later mailed it to the San Francisco Chronicle as proof. In the letters that followed, the Zodiac claimed responsibility for as many as 37 deaths. Investigators consider that number a boastful exaggeration, though the true count may extend beyond the 5 confirmed victims. The 1966 case of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside has sometimes been attributed, but the connection remains contested. The investigation was massive and fractured across multiple jurisdictions. Vallejo, Napa County, San Francisco, and Solano County each held pieces of the case, and the lack of a centralized command structure meant that evidence and leads were not always shared efficiently. The most prominent suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a Vallejo schoolteacher who was later institutionalized for misconduct involving a minor in 1975. He passed away in 1992. Mageau identified Allen from a photo lineup in 1991, but DNA recovered from stamps and envelopes, fingerprints from Stein's cab, and handwriting analysis did not match Allen. In 2018, Vallejo police attempted to use genetic genealogy databases to generate new leads, but the effort did not produce definitive results. None of the physical evidence matched any of the roughly 2,500 suspects investigated over the decades. In 2021, a group calling themselves the Case Breakers named Gary Francis Post, who had passed away in 2018, as their candidate. Law enforcement agencies rejected the claim. Other theories have pointed to Earl Van Best Jr. and dozens more. None have been substantiated. The Z340 cipher, solved in December of 2020 by David Oranchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck using Van Eyck's AS-Decrypt software, provided no path to identification. The solved message was more taunting than informative. a statement about not fearing the gas chamber, and a denial of appearing on a television show. 2 additional ciphers, the Z13 and Z32, remain unsolved. Cryptographers believe the Z13 may contain the Zodiac's real name, but at just 13 characters, it does not provide enough data for reliable decryption. The San Francisco Police Department marked the case inactive in April of 2004, reactivated it in March of 2007, and it remains officially open. The FBI San Francisco Division listed the case as an ongoing investigation as of 2021, though researcher Tom Voigt stated in 2025 that the Bureau was no longer actively working it. The case remains open in Napa County and in Riverside in connection with the contested 1966 Bates case. The Zodiac taunted police with letters and ciphers, practically begging for attention. But in Philadelphia, a decade and a half later, a series of attacks unfolded without a single word from the person responsible, and the investigation that followed may have sent an innocent man to prison. The Frankfurt Slasher. In December of 1990, a Philadelphia jury convicted Leonard Christopher of taking the life of Carol Dowd in the Frankfurt neighborhood. The case seemed straightforward. His workplace was directly behind where Dowd's body was found. But 3 months after his conviction, while Christopher sat in prison, another woman was harmed fatally in the same neighborhood, in the same manner, matching the same pattern that had terrorized Frankfurt for 5 years. The case against the so-called Frankfurt Slasher suddenly had a problem that no courtroom could resolve. This story does not start with Leonard Christopher. It starts with a stretch of Frankfurt Avenue in northeast Philadelphia where, beginning in 1985, women began losing their lives in strikingly similar ways. Between August of 1985 and September of 1990, 8 to 9 women were found harmed fatally across the Frankfurt corridor. Helen Patent, 52, was found on August 19, 1985, near a SEPTA train yard, having suffered 47 stab wounds. Anna Carroll, 68, was found in January of 1986 with 6 stab wounds and the weapon still in her body. Suzanne Olsef was discovered on Christmas Day of 1986. Jean Durkin, 28, was found in January of 1987, having endured 74 stab wounds. Margaret Vaughn, 66, in November of 1988. Teresa Sciortino, 30, in January of 1989. Carol Dowd, 46, in April of 1990. The victims were predominantly white women, many of them older, and many frequented the bars along Frankfurt Avenue. All were assaulted and stabbed. Multiple witnesses across different cases described a middle-aged white male seen with several of the victims shortly before they were harmed. Leonard Christopher, who worked at a fish market behind which Dowd's disemboweled body was found, was arrested on May 5, 1990. He was convicted of first-degree taking of life in December of that year and sentenced to life in prison. There was a fundamental problem with the conviction, however. Christopher was black. Every witness description of the man seen with the victims described a white male. And then, on September 6, 1990, while Christopher was in custody, Michelle Denner, 30, was found harmed fatally in the same neighborhood, bearing the same hallmarks as the preceding cases. The Donner case alone should have prompted a full re-examination. The stab wounds, the location, and the victim profile were all consistent with the earlier pattern. If the Frankfurt Slasher was one person, that person was still active while Christopher sat behind bars. The prosecution's case rested on proximity, his workplace near the crime scene, and circumstantial evidence. It did not account for the witness descriptions, and it could not explain the 9th victim. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Christopher's conviction was never overturned. Innocence Project attorney Marissa Bluestein and journalist Walt Hunter have both publicly questioned whether the right man was in that cell. Christopher maintained his innocence for the rest of his life. He passed away in prison from cancer without ever being exonerated. As of 2026, 8 of the 9 Frankfurt Slasher cases remain officially open. DNA from preserved evidence is reportedly being retested with modern technology, the Philadelphia Police Department has declined to comment on specifics. The identity of the white male seen with multiple victims across multiple years has never been established. In Frankfurt, the pattern was spread across 5 years and an entire neighborhood. But in Atlantic City, a discovery in November of 2006 revealed 4 women in a single drainage ditch, all found within hours of each other, all positioned the same way, as if the person responsible had arranged them deliberately. The Eastbound Strangler. On November 20th, 2006, 2 people walking near the Golden Key Motel on Black Horse Pike in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey, spotted a body in a drainage ditch about 50 yards behind the property. Within hours, 3 more bodies were found in the same ditch, each roughly 60 feet apart, all face down with arms outstretched, heads pointing east, shoes and socks removed, but otherwise clothed. What nobody knew at the time was that all 4 women had disappeared from the same few blocks of Atlantic City's Pacific Avenue over the previous 5 weeks. The Golden Key Motel, which would become the geographic anchor of this investigation, was a rundown property on a highway that most travelers passed without a second look. That anonymity would prove to be the case's defining obstacle. The 4 victims were identified as Kim Raffo, 35, a former waitress originally from Canarsie, Brooklyn, who had been strangled with a cord; Tracy Ann Roberts, 23, a former dancer from Delaware who had been asphyxiated; Barbara Breedor, 42, a former casino cocktail waitress who had disappeared in October of 2006 and was too decomposed for a definitive cause of death; and Molly Jean Diltz, 20, originally from Black Lick, Pennsylvania, the only victim without a connection to the local street economy, also too decomposed for a determination. All 4 women had been living in the orbit of Atlantic City's red light district along Pacific Avenue. 3 of the 4 had histories tied to that economy. Molly Jean Diltz was the exception. She had no known connection to the streets, and investigators have never been able to explain how she ended up in the same drainage ditch as the other 3. Her presence in the group complicated the profile of the offender and widened the range of potential victims beyond what investigators initially assumed. The investigation focused on individuals connected to the Golden Key Motel and the surrounding area. Terry Olson, a 41-year-old repairman who had been living at the motel, was implicated by his girlfriend. His DNA did not match evidence from the scene. Eldred Raymond Burchell, who referred to himself by a river-related nickname, reportedly told a local woman that he was responsible. He was investigated and cleared. The most significant development came in July 2023, when Rex Hoyerman was arrested in connection with the Gilgo Beach case on Long Island. Suffolk County investigators confirmed they were looking into possible connections between Hoyerman and cases in multiple states, including Atlantic City. Hoyerman had maintained timeshares in Las Vegas between 2003 and 2005 and had documented travel patterns along the eastern seaboard. Atlantic County Prosecutor William Reynolds has not confirmed any formal connection. No DNA match has been announced. The timing of the Gilgo Beach arrest did prompt investigators to revisit the Eastbound Strangler evidence, but as of the latest public statements, no new forensic links have been established. The positioning of the 4 bodies remains one of the most distinctive elements of the case. All 4 were face down, arms extended, heads east, in a straight line roughly 60 feet apart. Investigators have interpreted this as deliberate staging, possibly ritualistic or simply methodical. The removal of shoes and socks from all 4 victims has never been explained. Whatever the arrangement meant to the person who placed them there, it has not been enough to identify him. As of 2026, the Eastbound Strangler case is open. A reward of up to $100,000 remains in place. The Hoyerman angle has generated renewed public attention, but no charges related to Atlantic City. The 4 women found in that drainage ditch remain without a named suspect. And somehow, it gets worse. Because while the Eastbound Strangler left 4 victims in a single location, the next case involves a suspect who walked into a police station, led detectives toward a body, and still was never charged. The Honolulu Strangler. Between May of 1985 and April of 1986. 5 women in Honolulu were found assaulted and strangled, their hands bound behind their backs with the same type of rope. The Honolulu Police Department formed a 27-person task force. The FBI was brought in, and then a man walked into the station, said a psychic had told him where the latest victim's body could be found, and led officers close to the exact location. It was the spring of 1985, and Honolulu was not a city that expected this kind of violence. The islands had never dealt with a confirmed series of this nature, and the first case was initially treated as an isolated event. Vicky Gail Purdy, 25, a military spouse, was last seen on May 29, 1985, near the Shorebird Hotel in Waikiki. Her body was found the next day at Kihei Lagoon, with her hands bound behind her back. A young student vanished from a Waipahu bus stop on January 14, 1986, and was found the following day at the same lagoon, bound in the same way. Denise Hughes, 21, a telephone company secretary, was found on February 1st near Moanalua Stream, wrapped in a blue tarp. Louise Medeiros, 25, 3-month pregnant, disappeared from a Honolulu airport bus stop on March 26th and was found a week later near Waikiki Stream. Linda Pesci, 36, disappeared on April the 29th and was found on May 3rd on Sand Island. Every victim had been strangled. Every victim's hands had been bound behind their back with parachute rope. The consistency of the method pointed unmistakably to a single individual. The fact that all 5 women were found near bodies of water in lagoons, streams, and coastal areas around Oahu added another layer to the pattern. The attacks were spaced weeks or months apart, and the geographic spread across the island made it difficult for any single precinct to assemble the full picture early on. The Honolulu Police Department established the task force on February 5, 1986, incorporating FBI assistance and expertise from the Green River Task Force. The investigation zeroed in on Howard Arthur Gay, also known as Howard Gay Dutcher, a 43-year-old divorced man who worked near the airport. Gay came to police, claiming a psychic had told him Linda Pesci's body was on Sand Island. He led officers near the site where she was eventually found. His ex-wife and girlfriend both described him as someone who practiced bondage, binding women's hands behind their backs. Both women said the timeline of the attacks coincided with nights he had fought with them and left the house. He failed a polygraph. A witness identified him from a photo lineup as the man last seen with Pesci, but refused to testify because she believed he had seen her and feared for her safety. Gay was arrested on May 9, 1986, but released for insufficient evidence. He was never charged. The circumstantial case was strong: the proximity to the airport, the rope, the timeline, the behavioral profile from 2 women who knew him intimately. But without the testimony of the witness who identified him in the photo lineup, and without physical evidence tying him to any of the 5 crime scenes, prosecutors could not move forward. Gay relocated to mainland California. The attack stopped. Hawaii's first confirmed serial case ended not with an arrest, but with a suspect's departure. Gay passed away on November 2, 2003, at the age of 60, from kidney failure in Apple Valley, California. No similar cases were ever linked to him after he left the islands. As of 2026, the Honolulu Strangler case is classified as cold. No major DNA breakthrough has been publicly announced. The prime suspect lived for 17 years after the final attack, moved across the Pacific, and never faced a courtroom for what happened in Honolulu. 5 women, 1 suspect, and a case file that closed not with a verdict, but with his passing. Most of the cases covered here involve a single unidentified offender and a clear pattern. But the final case started with that same assumption: a single figure operating across the American West. And over the years, that theory fell apart entirely, replaced by something more complicated and, in many ways, more unsettling. The Great Basin Murders. For more than a decade, investigators across Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and Idaho worked under a single theory: that one person was responsible for the deaths of at least 9 women found along the highways and desolate stretches of the Great Basin. The cases shared geography, victimology, and a chilling method of disposal. So why, after years of investigation, did law enforcement abandon the idea of a single offender entirely? Decades before any task force or DNA database existed for these cases, the highways of the American West were among the most dangerous places for a young woman traveling alone. Truck stops, rest areas, and long empty stretches between towns created an environment where people could vanish without anyone knowing for days. The list of cases, originally grouped under the Great Basin umbrella, spans from 1983 to 1997. Janelle Lee Johnson, 23, was hitchhiking from Denver to Riverton, Wyoming, when she was last seen on February 17, 1983. She was found harmed fatally in Fremont County less than 2 weeks later. Lisa Marie Kimmel vanished on March 25, 1988, and her body was recovered from the North Platte River near Casper, Wyoming, on April 2nd. A couple, Patricia Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski, disappeared while hitchhiking in 1989. An unidentified woman known as Bitter Creek Betty was found on March 1, 1992, near Bitter Creek, Wyoming. Another unidentified woman was found near Interstate 80 in Elko County, Nevada, on November 16, 1993, posed in a crucifix shape with 2 gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber firearm. A woman with a similar posing pattern had been found years earlier near Death, Nevada. Additional cases in Utah and across the corridor were folded into the same working theory. The turning point came with DNA. In 2002, a CODIS match linked the Kimmel case to Dale Wayne Eaton, whose property in Moneta, Wyoming, yielded the missing car. Eaton was convicted and sentenced to death. Patricia Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski were connected to Robert Ben Rhodes, a long-haul truck driver who confessed. Another case on the original list was resolved when a victim's husband, Howell Williams, was convicted in Utah in 1999. And in 2014, DNA work linked the Bitter Creek Betty case to forensic samples that were eventually tied to truck driver Clark Perry Baldwin, who was arrested in 2020. One by one, individual cases were solved, and each solution pointed to a different offender. The umbrella theory of a single Great Basin figure collapsed. Investigators now believe the geographic and victimological similarities were a product of the environment. Long remote highways that attracted multiple offenders operating independently rather than a single organized pattern. The interstate highway system, the vastness of the terrain, and the transient nature of truck stops created conditions where disappearances could go unnoticed for weeks or months. It was not one offender. It was a landscape that enabled many. Dale Wayne Eaton remains on death row in Wyoming and is considered a person of concern in additional unsolved cases, including the 1997 disappearance of Amy Rowe Bechtel, who vanished while jogging near Lander, Wyoming, and whose remains have never been found. Multi-state investigators have questioned Eaton about the Bechtel case, but no charges have followed. The Janelle Lee Johnson case, the 2 unidentified Nevada women posed in crucifix positions, and several other cases on the original list remain open. The unidentified victims have never been named despite decades of forensic efforts. As of 2026, the Great Basin cases are investigated individually. The single offender theory has been formally abandoned. What began as a hunt for one man became a reckoning with a harder truth, that the geography itself was the common thread, and the number of people willing to exploit it was never limited to 1. 10 cases, exposed by DNA, witness accounts, forensic breakthroughs, and persistence. Some may be solved in the years ahead, others may not. The investigations continue. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.